It's always been about how do we innovate in everything that we do and how do we scale our innovation. In order to deliver on our mission for patients, which is to bring innovation, we have to be able to innovate at scale.
Karen's at the center of a lot of this work as the new leader in the organization, and there's obviously a tremendous amount of responsibility that comes with the work.
Innovation doesn't come from average. Breakthrough ideas don't come from average. We have to actively fight against consensus because sometimes it's easier just to ask the boss or just to go to the average, and that's not what we're looking for.
What do you think is the most underappreciated responsibility of the CEO when it comes to sustaining innovation?
I think just modeling the way and modeling the leadership behaviors that allow innovation to thrive. And I think it can be really difficult for any leader, including the CEO, when you feel the pressure of you have to deliver and you have to execute every day. And by the way, every person in Argenx feels that way.
All right. So Karen, I got to say this. I'm very excited about today's conversation. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. I'm a very big fan of Argenx and the work that you and your team are doing. So I'm going to start by just to kind of jump into this. You know, you're stepping into the CEO role at Argenx after serving as COO. You were obviously very deeply embedded in execution. And really, I want the conversation to start there. How does your personal definition of innovation change when you move from operationalizing it day to day to being accountable for its long-term durability as CEO?
Yeah, thanks, Chase. First of all, thanks for having me. And I love the way you framed that question, actually, because it's around durability of innovation. And it takes me back to the first conversation that I had with Tim, our current CEO and co-founder. He and I, during our first conversation, we aligned on something really important to both of us, which was that our objective and our goal was to build a company for the long term and build a biotech company that continues to innovate at scale over the long term and stays independent because of that. So from day one, coming into Argenx in the CEO role and working with Tim and the rest of the team, it's always been about how do we innovate in everything that we do and how do we scale our innovation? And when we talk about that, we don't mean just scaling innovation in terms of our reason for being. How do we make sure that we can bring more medicines and more innovative medicines to patients over time? But it's also how do we actually innovate in how we scale? How do we innovate in how we work? In how we accelerate, how we bring these medicines to patients? How do we make sure that we don't fall into the trap that we've seen many other companies fall into, that as they get bigger, they become hierarchical and bureaucratic and lose the ability to innovate? So for us, it's always been, and for me, it's always been tied together, that in order to deliver on our mission for patients, which is to bring innovation, we have to be able to innovate at scale. And there's an execution piece always to that.
I mean, look, it's obvious that you guys have been successful in doing that so far, right? And for the listeners that are less familiar with Argenx as a company, you know, really, it's a very exciting biotech company focused on treating serious autoimmune diseases. And if we were to think about this at a simple level, Argenx studies how the immune system goes wrong in certain diseases and then designs targeted antibody therapies to correct those problems rather than more broadly suppressing the immune system. And so I'm really excited because Karen's at the center of a lot of this work as the new leader in the organization. And there's obviously a tremendous amount of responsibility that comes with the work Karen is doing in this role. Now, I have to say, Karen, you know, we talked a little bit about how innovation can oftentimes be constrained by regulation or risk. But in practice, obviously, that's rarely the whole story, right? From inside the organization, what have you found to be the true limiting factor on speed and progress?
Yeah, I think it's BS that it's not regulations or anything else. You can see plenty of examples in biotech, but also outside of biotech in regulated industries where people have incredible innovation. So I definitely don't think that is. For me, what kills innovation is hierarchy, bureaucracy, ways of working that, and it often comes with size, that all of a sudden leaders within the organization and in fact across the culture of the organization starts to become risk averse. It starts to protect what you have rather than creating something new. You start to slow down because of that risk aversion, and also just because of you navigating all of these processes and SOPs and all of this stuff that's put in place to manage the bureaucracy, rather than having people focused on the real thing, which is what's the next innovation? What's the next big thing? How are we going to disrupt autoimmune diseases and bring incredible medicines to patients? And we can do that in terms of, yes, the medicines, the molecules we're developing, but also how we're doing innovative clinical trial design to go more quickly, to bring our medicines faster, or in our commercial organization. But it sounds soft, but it's everything that contributes to the attitude, the culture, and leadership plays a big part in making sure that you retain that spirit.
One thing I've observed across pharma is that innovation can sometimes be treated as a program, a function, or a moment in time. From your operating experience, what does it actually take to make innovation a repeatable system rather than a series of isolated successes?
Yeah. I like the idea of the repeatable nature of it. I mean, I think, first of all, we say at Argenx that innovation is everyone's business. Every single person in the organization should be thinking about how to innovate the work that they're doing. And that can be on the small scale or on the big scale. But it has to be more than just words. And to your point about a repeatable system, I think for me, it comes down to a few different pieces. One is you have to put the structure in place. And for us, we landed on a teams-based structure that allows innovation to happen in these small cells or small pockets. So I think if you have diverse teams that are well-functioning teams that are, and we can talk about what that looks like, that are focused on innovation, then you have one of the building blocks. So we're all about scaling an empowered network of teams. I think the second piece is you have to teach those teams and build and really invest in the skills on the teams of how to innovate and how to work together to effectively innovate. And then you have to create the environment where they're actually encouraged and incentivized to do things in an innovative way. So, encouraging experimentation, rewarding experimentation. We often talk about, especially in our early stage programs, how can we do the last experiment first? And we try to bring that to all parts of our organization so that our teams are not thinking in a linear fashion, but you have to also reward that and encourage it. And so I think if you put those pieces in place, then you can start to build these cells of innovation that are independent from each other and yet connected. And you can start to move more quickly and start to get some of that innovation coming out of every part of the organization.
It's interesting that you bring up the cell-based structure. One thing that came to mind as you were going down that path is some of the innovative mechanisms that we've seen historically, even in areas like manufacturing, where, I don't know if you look at what Toyota did around building cell-based manufacturing into their processes. It was one fluid assembly line, but then there were these individual cells that were producing individual parts, and that vastly improved the minimizing error and really maximizing efficiency within these. And it's changed manufacturing. Like it's really revolutionized it. And so I have this mental model in my brain around how you're describing it with individual teams that are as one team completes one process that's essential to producing that therapeutic, how does that get passed down to the next? And how do you create that swift, even flow between one team and the next? And I know that you've probably spent a lot of time thinking about that as the COO prior to becoming now CEO of the organization. So it's very exciting to have someone like yourself in that role, given the operational experience that you've had. Out of curiosity, one of the other things I always like to think about is, I kind of what you described, it comes down to almost, as you were speaking, I almost think about it as a triangle of there's the people piece, there's the process piece, and then there's the incentive piece. And how do you find alignment between all three? I'm curious, like when you think about, you mentioned the incentive piece, you mentioned the process piece, really embedding innovation within each of these, each of these cells or each of these individual teams. How do you find the cohesiveness between these teams as information or knowledge transfer moves from one group to the next?
Yeah, it's actually one of the hardest parts about operationalizing this. And so we have a few different ideas and thoughts there. And I would say we're still learning and discovering how we can do that best. But a few thoughts that I think are helpful. One is when Argenx started, so this is definitely before my time, one of the insights from Tim and the co-founders and when they first started structuring the teams was it sounds obvious, but have the team follow the molecule for as long as the team members, let's say, interested and want to. And so what you have is people that some consistency amongst the team that moves through the different phases from all the way from the beginning to the end with some turnover or some change because you're having different skills come in at different stages. But we have clinical scientists that stay from very early to quite late. And that's different from how many companies do it, where it is a handover and kind of a very stark handover from phase to phase. So I think that's helped us because you have some of that continuity in the teams and of some of the information. The other thing, though, that's really important is that as you're going from phase to phase is how do you, and also as you're getting, let's say, bigger. So if you've got a commercial asset, it's no longer just one team that's working on Vyvgart. I mean, we have a lot of different teams working on Vyvgart. And the question is, how do you make sure that all those different cells stay connected, know what's going on? And so that's where our network comes in. And we try to use a very simple frame for this, where we try to have overlapping members on different teams who have the responsibility of being the connector between the teams. So we have an indication development team and an indication commercial team, and they have overlapping members. And through that, they don't do the same work, but they're both, but they have, overlapping members, so they know what's happening and they can share the insights. We also focus very much on honestly, this very basic but human interaction that we say with our network, which is when all information should flow transparently and easily and very casually between the network. So one of the things I think that stops innovation, stops information flow and transparency is this formal structured communication that you often get when you start to get into bigger companies. So, we use chat and we try to be in the office. We don't mandate that people are in the office, but we try when they're here, have those conversations and just connect as humans and keep connecting as humans and thinking about that. And it sounds very lo-fi or very, but it's actually, I think it's a huge enabler of innovation because it spreads information more quickly. It brings more transparency. It lowers the bar in terms of how you engage with people and just allows for this more creative spark through the organization.
No, I love that. And I really like how you describe ways of simplifying that information flow and the thought that goes into it. One of the challenges a lot of organizations have is as they scale, decisions, they tend to slow. And it has nothing to do, even if the incentives are right, even if the processes are right, and you have the right people in place. I mean, it doesn't have to do with leaders lacking ambition, but really has to do with decision rights, which become a little less clear as organization becomes larger, potentially more and more bureaucratic. How do you think about designing some decision frameworks that can help preserve some accountability while still maintaining independence and also enabling these teams to move at extreme urgency?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of work on this, and I would say definitely it's a constant work in progress, especially as you're growing. But there's a few different things that we're thinking about. One is being really clear on what's the type of decision-making model that we have. And I would say there's a few different types. One of them is this authoritative decision-making model, which ends up coming in sort of hierarchical organizations where the way that decisions are coordinated is they have to go to the top, and then those people make the decision that comes back down. And those decisions end up becoming irrelevant because the people at the top get often not the best information. They're not closest to the work. So we're actively not in an authoritative and we're not in a hierarchical decision-making framework. But at the other end of the extreme, you have this consensus-based. And I think that's the trap, the real trap that we're trying to avoid, which is you put people in these teams, they have a shared outcome, but it's hard. It can often drift towards consensus, and consensus often drifts towards average. And, innovation doesn't come from average. Breakthrough ideas don't come from average. And we're not looking for average. We need more than that. So we have to actively fight against consensus. And so we use this consultative decision-making model, which is, let's be clear about who should make the decision. And that's the person or the team that's closest to the work. So I was talking about indication teams earlier. Indication teams should make decisions about their indication. Asset teams should make decisions about their asset. But they have to be really clear about who are they consulting to make those decisions, and who are they consulting to make those decisions faster and higher quality decisions. And so, of course, sometimes there'll be senior management because it has implications for the long term of the company. Sometimes they have to consult with other assets because that might be impacted, or whatever it is. This idea that if there's someone that's impacted by the decision, or someone who might have more or different information on the decision, then consult with them and right size that amount of consulting based on how big the decision is, whether it's a one-way door or not. And so we try to be really clear on the frameworks, and then building the skill within the team to actually bring that to life, and frankly, the discipline of bringing that to life. Because sometimes it's easier just to ask the boss or just to go to the average. And that's not what we're looking for.
That totally makes sense. I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit towards the handoff between science and impact. Where do you most often see disconnects between scientific innovation and commercial execution? Obviously, two very different teams, but two very important teams when it comes to the fundamentals of building a successful biotech and pharma company. So out of curiosity, where do you see these disconnects? And just to kind of tag on, how can leaders intervene earlier to ensure continuity from discovery all the way through delivery?
Yeah. For me, it is a function of these hierarchical or of these silos that emerge. And we've all been in those companies. And I think what happens is, where it goes wrong is teams lose sight of, and the company loses sight of, what's the shared purpose of all of us. And generally, with any molecule, everyone's purpose across the whole organization is to get that molecule to more patients faster. But we break that down in different functions into different measures. So, in development, it's hit this milestone as fast as possible, which, and so they have discussions about how might I be able to get there? I can do a shorter trial, or I'll only go to these sites, or whatever it is. And then in commercial, it's about, I want to go to as many countries as possible, and I want to, have as many endpoints as possible, because then I can talk about all of the benefits. And so both are actually solving for the same thing, getting medicines to more patients faster. But as a company, you break that down into what seems like meaningful metrics to measure people on within those functions. And all of a sudden you create this disconnect, and that disconnect can become bigger and bigger depending on how strong the incentives are and how you're structured and all of that. So it's coming back to this idea of how do you focus on the shared purpose that we all have, and create diverse teams around that. So I was mentioning earlier, we have indication development teams, indication commercial teams, and they have shared membership. They develop one plan together. There's different parts of the commercial plan, different parts of the development plan, but it all ladders up to the same objective. And so that puts the same. That means when they're getting in a room together and these are difficult trade-offs sometimes that you're making. I don't want to suggest that it's easy or there's one size fits all. And so you need people to have the same outcome that they're working towards, and then get into that room and have the skills to have the creative abrasion and to talk it out. And what are the pros and what are the cons? And neither of these are great options, but we're going to have to choose one. And then maybe we come up with, no, actually we could do this third option. But I think you have to set that environment for the teams. Otherwise it just becomes, as you said, an us versus them, which doesn't really make sense to me, because we do all have the same objective at the end of the day. It's all about finding the alignment between different groups, right? And how does the day-to-day work? How does the day-to-day work align? And if you think about it, it's no different to how products are designed, right? Between how end users experience it all the way up to the top of the ladder around how decisions get made. The other thing that I find interesting is, and I tend to see this across companies of all sizes, is operational discipline is obviously essential in pharma. But over time, process can sometimes quietly churn into things like constraint. So how do you evaluate when process is truly enabling innovation versus when it has started to suppress it? Yeah, I agree with you. Often the process is the enemy of innovation. And I think, and that's because it's looking for what is process trying to do? It's trying to standardize, and it's trying to create efficiency. And so look, in some ways, standardization in some things is good, and certainly in our industry, it's needed. So I want to be clear, we need some processes and there's some reasons to do that. But I think focusing less on the outcome of standardization and efficiency and more on the outcome of how are we enabling our teams to deliver high quality data, whatever it is, high quality in their day-to-day work. And sometimes playbooks can be helpful for that. So you're not reinventing the wheel, but playbooks can feel a little a little more flexible than having an SOP. And you might have an SOP behind it, but the way that you bring it to life, so it is through a playbook or whatever it is, so that it feels more real and enabling the day-to-day work. Certainly, from my perspective, to the second part of your question, because we do a lot of work on how do we innovate in this space, the way that I sort of know or at least can sense that process is getting in our way is when teams start to do things that objectively from the outside, which often that's one thing that as leaders we can do, we're on the outside kind of seeing teams execute, and objectively from the outside, it's like, this makes no sense. No rational person would be doing this in this way, in this. And now I'm not suggesting that the process doesn't make sense, but the process doesn't make sense in 100% of cases. And when you're in a situation where teams are blindly following the process, and then you ask them hey, this doesn't seem to make sense. Why are we doing this? And they say, well, I'm following the process. It's like, that's when you have an issue. And there's different ways, there's different parts of that issue. Is it because the process is out of date? Is it because people don't understand that, okay, the process is there, but you can deviate. You just have to have a good reason why. There's tons of different reasons, but as a leader, being engaged and on top and asking those questions when you see, and then challenging, okay, why is this happening? This doesn't seem like a rational way of solving this problem or going about this work, or it certainly doesn't feel like the fastest way, and making it safe for people to have those conversations and valuing the work of the teams that do define the policies and create the playbooks. Because go back to innovation is everyone's business. And at Argenx, we ask them, innovate how we do that. We know it's necessary and we're in a regulated environment. And they do a fantastic job of coming up with innovative outcomes-based ways of writing our policies, bringing them to life with our teams. But it takes effort every day not to slide into the world of bureaucracy.
I can really appreciate that. And, in everything that you described, really centers around this concept of first principle thinking, right? Really yes. Being able to point out, like when something seems utterly irrational and, we're just following it because the process is there, and how as leaders do we identify those pain points and problems, really boil them down into basic problems that we might need solutions to solve. And I really like the essence of how you describe that, because it really centers around some of the most successful companies have been built around first principle thinking. So I really appreciate how you describe it. The other thing is culture gets talked about a lot, often abstractly. And I know that, culture is something that you now are thinking, I'm sure, a lot about as CEO of the business. From an operator's perspective, which incentives or metrics actually reinforce innovative behaviors and which unintentionally discourage it, especially from a cultural perspective? Yeah. How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a big question. So, but if we focus it on incentives, I think one of the things that gets in the way of innovation with incentives is when you set these fixed targets and you incentivize people to hit these fixed targets. So we talk a lot about this in terms of our beyond budgeting framework, where and that type of thing. But this idea it's very simple, and it's also first principles. If someone's accountable for setting their revenue target or when their study is going to end or whatever it is, and it's fixed in time, and then their personal pay and incentive and everything, they're whether they're going to get promoted, all of those incentives are behind hitting that objective, then what's going to happen over time? Human nature, all of us, I say this without any judgment, try to lower that bar, try to make it, and also get so fixated on hitting that, even if it's just a project plan, you just get so fixated on hitting that, and you start to become so narrowly focused that you miss what's happening outside of the four walls. What's changed in the environment that might make me change my plan? Could I think differently? Whatever it is, because you're just so narrowly focused. And so I think having those fixed targets, whether they be revenue or timelines or whatever it is. Now, of course, at a public company, you can't get away from that completely. We can't, but what we try to do as much as possible is, we don't have fixed budgets. We have this thing called beyond budgeting. So let's make sure we're updating and we're continually sort of progressing our thinking. We work in 90-day cycles. How do we make sure, okay, we know what's going to happen the next 90 days. We don't really know beyond that. Let's make sure we're setting a time to stop, think, look around. Did anything change? Do we have a new idea, et cetera? And so I think by creating less of that pressure, I think you allow a little bit more of a safe space to innovate, to experiment, and the incentives that go behind it.
Well said. Well said. I'm again, I feel like we can't be having a conversation about innovation these days if we're not at least talking a little bit about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Digital data and AI capabilities are obviously increasingly central to how pharma operates. How do you ensure these tools become embedded in the infrastructure that you all are scaling, and rather than just remaining as pilots or side projects? But how do you take all of that and bring it to commercial, bring it to R&D when it comes to many of these new tools?
Yeah. So it goes back to some of the principles we've been talking about, which, just like you don't create a function who's accountable for innovation, you don't create a function who's, they're the only people that are accountable for technology and for AI. We try to embed that within the organization, within our incentives, and make it everyone's business. So part of, when we call it scaling in the Argenx way, part of that is asking every single person as they're thinking, and every single team when they're coming up with their plans, is there a way you can automate, digitize, leverage technology, being thoughtful that every team is thinking about that and building that into their plans, so that then what we call our digital technology team can also can work with them on those plans, and then can bring them to life. So we make it everybody's business, and we embed it, as I say, very much in scaling in the Argenx way, and our framework for that. And I think the other piece to this is, especially with AI, there's the data piece where you have to, this is one place where actually standardization and having platforms does help. So we were talking earlier, it's, standardization is not always a bad thing, because actually it can help innovation. So standardizing and thinking about how do we make sure that we have that platform that we can build on top of, but then also making sure that we're not just too early going with one technology is another piece of our strategy. So, there are some platforms that are further along in their development. There's, in some places in our early discovery, it's really early in terms of AI use and that type of thing as well. Okay, we should experiment, and we should partner with a few different people early on and learn as much as we can. Let's not narrow in on one partner too early. So having a sort of a portfolio approach to how we're experimenting with some of these technologies, where you might be taking some big bets that are when it's further along and a little more mature. And I would actually, in some places in commercial, it's a bit more like that, versus placing a number of different bets, a number of different partnerships, and learning from all of them, and having the flexibility that in the future, when we see which one makes the most sense, then we can go in that direction.
I love how you're thinking about that. That's, it really enables the right level of risk mitigation when it comes to the approach, and also, again, how do you maximize the learnings internally for the organization? Now, as we look ahead and you take on the CEO role, what do you think is the most underappreciated responsibility of the CEO when it comes to sustaining innovation?
I think just modeling the way, and modeling the behavior, the leadership behaviors that allow innovation to thrive. And I think it can be really difficult for any leader, including the CEO, when you feel the pressure of you have to deliver and you have to execute every day. And by the way, every person in Argenx feels that way. And everyone asks the question, but how do I do that? And how do I find time to innovate? And I think as any leader, but especially as a CEO, being able to model that, talk about it, actually live it, not just, so that you can really talk about it. Yeah. And modeling those leader behaviors that we were talking about not making decisions that other people can make, even though it might seem easier in the moment, either for you or for someone else, because actually in the long term, that's not helping us. I think modeling those behaviors is really important.
There's a few last things I have to ask. One centers around, some of the most creative moments I've had, and I know that, you can look at this within like foundational research that centers around how do individuals create innovative ideas, comes to the things that we might be doing as leaders outside the office. It comes down to being exposed to, some of my most creative ideas actually happened when I was in Japan. And I was in Naoshima and the Art Islands, surrounded by things that had zero to do with technology, zero to do with science. But it really enabled my mind to think more creatively and out of the box around new innovative approaches I could be taking as a leader. Out of curiosity, what is your happy place for where you find your mind, when you're outside the office and it really enables you to connect? Is it nature? Is it traveling to some other country? Is it skiing down the slopes? What is it for you that really enables you to find that innermost important motivator and muse for innovation?
Yeah, I love that question. And for me, it's actually changed, I would say, probably over my life, because when you first started asking that question, I was thinking about one thing that I think is really helpful for innovation for individuals as well as for teams is this diversity of experience and that you're talking about. And one of the things so I grew up in Australia, I moved to the US, I lived in London for a while, I now live in Switzerland. I've moved around a bunch. And when I look back, I didn't know it at the time, but when I look back, a big part of who I am is because I learned so much. And by the way, these are all Western countries, to your point about like, if you, let alone if you move somewhere that's, but the culture and is different enough that it just really makes you question. I remember when I first moved from Sydney to New York, and one of the first conversations I was having with someone, and they just came from this place of things that they were saying as if they were truths that to me weren't true at all. It was about politics, but it made me realize that how much of just assumptions you're making because of the environment that you've grown up in and what you've experienced. And I think if you have the experience of being in different places that are really uncomfortable, you start to see, there's all sorts of different ways to look at the world and that I didn't even know. And I think it starts to create different pathways in your mind. But nowadays, because I travel so much for work, and I have traveled a lot, what I love is what you were talking about is being in nature. So it's a different type of zen. I love hiking, I love cycling, I love skiing, but mostly because being out in the fresh air and just and doing that. And I think sometimes often my mind is working, and when I go away and I do that for a little bit, and then I'll come back and try and look at it again at a problem that I didn't think was solvable, and somehow in my subconscious my mind was working, but I needed to disconnect and I needed that time, and you come back and you think and you find that you have different solutions. So I would say both things for me.
That the path you just went down on your response had me thinking about when I came up with my first idea. It was in Australia, actually, close to Coogee Beach. And I was in a big debate with two individuals that had very, very different viewpoints as I did. And I don't remember exactly what we were debating about, but ultimately where the conversation led in the difference of ideas is what actually resulted in the origin of the first idea of my first company. And had I not put myself in that position to be uncomfortable, surrounded by people that have different ideals, characteristics, just a totally different framework. Like it to your point, like that's why I love, I think it's so important for all of us to just put ourselves in positions or in parts of the world where we might not have ever been in those positions from a value or from an ideal perspective. And it might be very different than things that we grew up with. And you never know what's going to come from those magical moments. And you don't know when they're going to come.
Absolutely. And it goes back to one of the questions that you asked around, okay, what happens between the science and commercial? And it's basically that. right? People grow up in commercial, in the industry, and they grow up in science. And then you put them in a team together and say, hey, you have a shared objective. And it can be pretty rocky because there's just different experiences and beliefs. But then that's when exactly what you described, that's when the innovation happens, because you have these conversations, you're curious, you're learning, and then you find a different way. And I mean, that's the exact spirit of having these diverse teams and working in this different way. And I love how you brought that to life.
No, Karen, before we stop the podcast, because I know I brought this up before we started recording, but I love the exposed brick wall. It's probably, and you mentioned to me that you're sitting within the office, right?
Yeah.
You're sitting in the office. It's just, honestly, I find that innovation also comes from being in, again, for me, it's being in a museum. I don't know what it is about exposed brick walls, but I just find that the environment, it just has me thinking about, once again, the environment that we're also in within the office can really be conducive for entirely new creative ideas. So it's a great thing. And where's the office, by the way, just so that everybody knows?
Our office is in Ghent at the moment, in Belgium, but we also have offices in Boston and Zurich and Tokyo, Sydney. Actually, we have offices all over, and I would say we take a very flexible approach to. We don't mandate that people come into the office a certain number of days and badge in and all of that. It's of all the most uninspiring things I find. However, we have lots of people in the office all the time, and we try to create an office environment that is inspiring for people to come to, and we try to create, we call them our innovation hubs. We try to create it so that it's a place where the unexpected encounter can occur. We call them offsite onsites. So many companies, you're coming into the office all the time, and so then to get time to think, you go to an offsite where you book a hotel somewhere and everyone has to travel. So we do those on site because it's like we see value. Actually, just today, we had two different teams that work on related things, and they happen to be doing an on-site, off-site here, and they were able to they ran into each other. We ended up doing a joint session. So it creates this energy and this hub. And so I think there are different ways, to your point, that you can think about office space, think about organizing how you work and where people need to be, and actually investing in that, not seeing it as an expense, but seeing it as an investment, and it's an investment in our innovation mission.
I love it. Well, Karen, I will tell you now, congratulations again on becoming the CEO of such an incredible organization. And look, I look forward to our next conversation, hopefully together within one of the innovation hubs.
That would be fantastic.
I love it. Well, again, Karen, thanks again, and looking forward to our next conversation soon.
Thank you so much, Chase. Bye.
Thank you.